Woo! Okay, here we go. Margin in a System 102. Here's another, not necessarily a deeper understanding, but a parallel understanding of margin in a system. I'm going to use this in construction management terms because that's what I'm familiar with. A typical, say, 3,500 square foot house at a $125 a square foot price point. So we'll say. So we're talking granite countertops and tile floors in your bathroom and kitchen and some nice trim. So you're looking at no elevators, nothing really spectacular in that sense, but just a typical well-built, nicely appointed house. Can take 8 to 12 months to build or longer. But the reality is the actual build time of actual labor hours on site to do the work really only takes 3.5 to 4 months. Ton of margin in that system. Doesn't feel like it when you're a project manager in construction, but there's a ton of margin in the system. Where is all that margin located? Okay. So I'll use a couple of trades. I'm going to use painting and drywall and really zoom in on that trade to show you how margin in the system works and doesn't work. So when I go and talk to my painter and we look at a job, and I'm a remodeler, so my work takes shorter amounts of time often than a new construction build. So a painter comes in, we look at the job, and I ask the painter, how long do you need to do the job? And here's what happens. He thinks to himself, he has some idea of how long it's going to take, and he might think, well, to prep and paint and second coat and touch up, we're looking at, he's thinking in his mind, like, 4 days. I can get this job done in 4 days. And then he speaks to me and he says, we're looking at about 6 or 7 days. He's built some margin, and that's appropriate because there's things he doesn't know. He doesn't know whether his guys are all going to be on site, if somebody's going to be sick, or their wife is going to, be in the hospital giving birth to the baby, or a truck's going to break down, or they're going to run into some problem or make a mistake and have to redo it. So he puts margin into the system. Now, me as a project manager, I hear him typically say, okay, it's going to take 6 days. Well, I know a lot of times he's late and runs over what he tells me, so I'm going to say 8 days. And that's what I'm going to put on my Gantt chart. So here's a Gantt chart graph. So once the drywall's done, it'll be time for paint. And he's told me, here's what's gone on. He knows he can get the job done in 4 days, but he adds a couple of days. And that's what he tells me. And then I know he's typically late and often runs over by a day or two, so I add a couple of days. And so what I stick in my Gantt chart is 8 days for painting, which is 200% what's actually necessary. The reason that I do that as a project manager is if my painter runs late by a day or two, but I've scheduled, so say that right there is a Monday. And if I don't build margin in and I tell my trim carpenter to come in on Tuesday, but if my paint contractor is late by a day or two and I have to put off my trim carpenter at the last minute, not only will I lose those couple of days I'd planned on him being there, he's going to say, well, Dave, if I can't start when you told me, I'm going to have to go to another job, and I'll have to put my guys on another job, and we'll be there for a week. So I know I need to build some margin in, so when I tell him to come in on that day, which is 8 days from the painter's start date, that there's a pretty high likelihood that I can meet that day. So I do tell him to come in on that following day after that 8-day time frame. Now here's what actually happens. Once that is established and I have that in the Gantt chart and I'm, working out my week over week scheduling and making my phone calls to subs and and I tell my painter, hey, that job's coming up. When we actually, this happens hundreds of times. This is not just my reality. This is construction management. Say he was supposed to start on a Tuesday, and he calls me Monday night and says, Dave, I can't start, man. I've got to finish up this job. I know I told you I would start on Tuesday, but I'm not going to be able to make it. It's probably going to be Wednesday. Well, in my mind, I think, well, I know I gave him an extra couple of days, so that's not a big deal. I say, sure, yeah. Well, then he gets to Tuesday, and he's like, man, we're still finishing up this job. I've had this exact conversation 50 times with just a painter, let alone all the subs I've dealt with. And I still know we're in the margin, but see, he's consuming the margin. He's consuming the margin at the beginning. And then it ends up being, all too often, and he was supposed to come in Tuesday, it ends up being Thursday afternoon before he finally shows up. And then he just sends one guy over to kind of deliver the paint. Not the 2 or 3 guys that should be there for 4 solid days to get it done in 4 days. I'm still not concerned because and I'll tell him, hey, can you still get it done? I have the trim carpenter coming, on that Tuesday or whatever. Yeah, I think so. All of a sudden, we've consumed enough margin that he's starting to be concerned. But what can you do? I can't go get another painter at that point, to ask him to come in and fix the problem. So now I'm just having to tell the trim carpenter, hey, I think we'll be done. What's your schedule? I start to feel him out, and it may be an extra day or two, and he's starting to get frustrated because he's already scheduled his week around me. And so often what happens, because the margin's been consumed and a subcontractor's living in this marginless situation where they're always running behind, always, paying it forward to the next job and finishing the job before by consuming margin that was scheduled for the next job they're supposed to go to. It's so easy just to live in that scenario. And so often, because before I started to understand margin, I would have that conversation, but I didn't really care whether they started exactly on that time because I knew I'd added margin to the end. But then once you get part of the way, close to where most of the margin's been consumed, all of a sudden it gets really stressful. And so often my trim carpenter will come in and the painter's still there doing touch-up. So imagine, I added 200%, and then I have to do the same thing with the trim carpenter, the same thing with the next guy. And for the most part, you're expanding. They're adding margin, and then I'm adding margin, and now the Gantt chart shows a 8 to 12 month build because there's all this margin in the wrong place. An alternative way, once I started to understand margin in a system, an alternative is, let me rebuild this. When you talk to the painting contractor and he's looking at the job, go back to that first conversation when he's there to look at the job, and you ask him, how long do you think this job will take? And in his mind, he thinks, well, 4 days, but I'll tell Dave 6, which is very appropriate. You need some margin in the system, but you need to isolate and locate the margin. And everybody in the system needs to understand where the margin is located and what you're watching. So instead of before, when I would say, yeah, that's fine if you don't come in on, that first day you're supposed to, because I know there's margin, and it starts to get consumed. When I have that conversation now, and I talk to the painter, and he tells me 6 days, I'll actually verbalize. So did you add some margin in there? Because I know there's going to be some unknowns, and maybe your trucks breaks down. And he tells me, yeah, I added a couple of days in. Oh, okay. So there's 2 days of margin in the system. And you know that, and let me write that down. 4 days with 2 days margin. And then when he calls me and tells me, and I'm not picking on painters, I'm a painter. That's why I'm picking on painters, I guess. But when he calls me and tells me I can't come on Tuesday, I can say, we talked about it was going to take 4 days, and we're starting to eat that 2 days of margin immediately. And I'm concerned about that. can we go ahead and get started? I would rather leave that margin for the end. Because we did talk about it. I've been talking to you for the last month and a half, and we've agreed on this date, and I want to be flexible, but the flexibility came in, 2 weeks ago when we discussed, and you told me, so I've built my whole schedule around it. So let's go ahead and get started. So it just changes the conversation, and both of you are understanding where the margin in the situation, and I tell them, I'm watching these 2 days of margin. I'm watching it get consumed. And I have my trim carpenter coming in because you told me it would take 6 days, and that included 2 days of margin. So you see, it changes the conversation a little bit when you identify what the margin is between all the stakeholders, and then you identify how you're watching that margin. And this is why this scenario up here, where somebody adds margin and then the project manager adds margin, but nobody's watching the margin, and everybody knows there's a lot of slop in there. And so this 4 days right here up in this situation ends up getting pushed so often because everybody's busy and there's a lot of unknowns, gets pushed out past those 8 days. And then you run into problems, and then you're having to fix, the problem with the trim carpenter and then all the subcontractors that follow. But by watching the margin, identifying it, letting all the stakeholders know where the margin is located in the system and what you're watching, gives you the capacity to generously have the conversation early rather than getting mad when you realize he's going to be, whatever subcontractor is going to be delaying the project and causing problems for the upcoming subcontractors. So margin in the system. So this is construction management, but this is true about so much in life. This is just my experiences with construction project management. But it's also true about how I plan my day, how I plan an event, is identifying where is the margin and then watching the margin. I'll obviously be talking more about that because it's such a big deal. So there we go. Margin 102 or 105 or 501, something like that.